What really happened with your host, Mike Rivero. You're listening to the Republic Broadcasting Network, where you'll find out what the Fukushima's going on.
And aloha, America. Welcome to our show today. It's Friday, April 6th, 2018. Thank goodness it's Friday. Thank goodness it's Friday, or it's Pauhana Friday, as we like to say here in the Hawaiian Islands. We have got a lot of stuff to talk about today. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443. Mike is in our control room, ready to answer the phone, put you on the air with your comments and questions. And, of course, in hour number 3, the lovely Lady Claire will be joining us again with her unique perspective on the world. So let's get right on into it. The Justice Department has missed the deadline to hand over FBI documents on the FISA warrant process, the Clinton Foundation, various other issues, details about just how it is that Hillary Clinton escaped prosecution for her Title 18 violations related to her private email server. And the Judiciary Committee has basically been trying to follow the normal procedures and get these documents, and the Justice Department has no legitimate reason to withhold them. So now the situation is amping up. They're talking about subpoenas. They're talking about contempt of Congress. They're talking about having Congress impeach officials of the Justice Department and the FBI. Impeachment is a process that is not restricted to just the president and the vice president. It can be used against any official that Congress feels is not doing their job. That is the teeth in the separation of powers and the 3 separate branches of government that are supposed to keep watch over each other, the way Thomas Jefferson set it all up. Now, investigators are starting to zero in on John Brennan's role in just how this dodgy dossier about Donald Trump, the one written by the former spy Christopher Steele, how did that come about? And basically, a lot of people are thinking Brennan might actually be in serious trouble. And, of course, a lot of people don't want him to be in trouble because he's got a lot of the secrets. So, John, all I can tell you is stay out of canoes. That's all I can tell you. Stay out of canoes. Now, an attorney for Trump, Jay Sekulow, and his senior counsel, Carly Gammill, appeared in a Washington, D.C. federal court to find out when they will be receiving documents related to the Obama unmasking scandal. And that is another serious issue. There are all these scandals out there, and official Washington is dragging its feet and obstructing and stonewalling and still hoping that Robert Mueller is going to try and find something with which they can take Trump down, because he's that outsider. Even though he's been compromised, he's going along with the agenda of the deep state for pretty much the most part, but that's not enough for them. They still want him out. And as far as Mueller's so-called investigation goes, it is clearly unconstitutional. And one of the reasons it has such a problem was reported by Greg Jarrett at Fox News, basically saying that when Mueller initially brought charges against Manafort, that Mueller is tasked with finding a crime that does not exist in law. Mueller was tasked with proving there was collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. But there is no crime of collusion with foreign countries anywhere in the U.S. statutory code. It does not exist. So there's no way they could prosecute. They're trying to find evidence that they could use for a potential impeachment if the Democrats steal the Congress this coming November. Now, Mueller's investigation long ago exceeded the scope of the special counsel law, which requires the scope of a special counsel to be specific. Now, Rosenstein created the special counsel with a scope so broad it is not supported by this law. Mueller is supposed to be looking at collusion, which is apparently not actually a crime, between the Russia campaign and, rather, the Trump campaign and Russia. He wasn't supposed to look into any of this other stuff. It's just completely inappropriate. It's outside the letter of the law. Mueller accepted the special counsel position with known conflicts of interest. And Rosenstein and Mueller's entire team have conflicts of interest. They're all Democratic supporters. They're anti-Trumpers. This thing is a farce from beginning to end. And it has gone on way, way too long. And the idea that Rosenstein retroactively expanded the scope of Mueller's task doesn't get around the restriction in the special counsel law. There has to be one specific issue being looked at, and that's all. Now, a lot of people are very concerned about John Bolton coming into the White House as the new national security advisor. He's a confirmed war hawk. He's pro-Israel. He's a neocon. And all during his career, he's just always talking about, we got to attack these people. We've got to attack those people. And a lot of people were saying, why did Trump bring this guy in when Trump campaigned on the promise of reducing, pulling back from these foreign entanglements, these foreign interventions? And now, of course, it's come on out that John Bolton is Sheldon Adelson's poodle, and Sheldon Adelson called up the president and said, you know, in exchange for all that money that I gave you, and especially in anticipation of all the money I might be inclined to give you for November, you will bring John Bolton in. We're going to do a shout out now to our on-air affiliates who are just now rejoining our network. So again, we have the finest government that money can buy, not just Congress, but apparently now the White House as well. And it's one of the reasons why early on in the history of this country, there were strict limits on how much money any individual could give to a candidate or a politician to level the playing field so that ordinary people like you and I had the same amount of influence over the government as the ultra-wealthy. And over time, the ultra-wealthy have whittled that away with the consent of Congress, because politicians always want more money. And as Aaron Russo used to say, your average politician would sell their own mother for $1. Now, getting into the war zones, the Syrian army is preparing to clear southern Syria of the militants. They've pretty much wrapped up the area around Ghouta. The militants there are leaving. They've surrendered their weapons. They're taking their families and they're going. So Syria is now starting to look down toward the south to take southern Syria and basically get the militants out of the Golan Heights. This, of course, is causing a ruckus down in Israel, because Israel is saying Syria shouldn't come into the Golan Heights because the Golan Heights represents a security buffer between Syria and Israel. Israel's once again saying, oh, everybody's out there wants to attack us. But when you look at who's actually doing the attacking, I mean, look how many times Israel has attacked Syria over the last couple of months. What Israel really wants is they want the Golan Heights. They've been militarily occupying it. They're selling the oil and gas from underneath it, even though technically it's not their property. And the war on Syria, actually, one of the reasons that launched is Israel wanted to have a pipeline running through Syria through which they could sell the oil and gas they're stealing from under the Golan to Europe. And of course, Syria is going to say, no, we're not going to give you a pipeline so that you can sell our oil and gas to Europe. And that was one of the reasons that the war began. Now, a lot of people are still talking about Donald Trump's flip-flop on Syria, and that, I guarantee, is going to come back to haunt him in 2020. The Democrats will seize on that. And I know because some years ago, I was involved in political advertising at the local level here, and there was a candidate who'd flip-flopped. And so we basically made a computer animation of his face on a fish in a fry pan, just flipping back and forth while the mouth was just speaking. And it was very effective. I actually got a personal thank you from the mayor who won, because I made the commercial for his campaign. Anyway, the Pentagon is saying there is no Syria pullout timeline, and apparently Trump is exasperated and frustrated, and he concedes. And basically, this is telling us Trump is not in control. Another factor that came into play is apparently after Trump announced he was going to pull out of Syria, he got a very tense phone call from Benjamin Netanyahu, who I guess laid down the law and said, no, you are not leaving Syria. So again, it's becoming more and more obvious the office of the president is not actually in charge of the country. The Pentagon is, Israel is, we've known that for a long time. The senior executive service is. The politicians that we elect, they're just a front. They don't really matter all that much anymore. Not in terms of the larger issues facing this country, like the economy and the wars. I mean, yes, if you vote for this or that politician, you may decide whether men are allowed to use the women's room or not. But that's really a very small issue compared to the larger issue of moving toward a world war. All right, we're going to take a phone call from Dustin in New Jersey. Aloha, Dustin. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
It's official. Trump has more flip-flops than Walmart, Target, and John Kerry combined. Mike, this is ridiculous. Did you see the stock market today?
It was insane. It's a good thing those buildings on Wall Street are all air-conditioned and you can't open the windows anymore, or it would have been raining stockbrokers all over the pavement.
They're not going to win a trade war. When are Americans going to understand? And that's not even including the $2 trillion in treasuries they have. We're a deadbeat nation, Mike. We live beyond our means. They own us because they buy our debt. The world buys our debt. We live beyond our means. When are people going to realize that? You know, I mean, this is insane.
Of course, it's insane. Of course, it's insane. Wall Street and our government sort of 30 years ago fell in love with the idea that if you just took a bunch of money and you shake it back and forth real hard, it will magically grow. And it doesn't work that way. You cannot have a working, viable economy unless you are manufacturing products for sale or growing agricultural produce for sale, or both. And our manufacturing has been in decline for 30 years, and nobody wants our GMO produce anymore. And the real tragedy there is the farmers in the United States who are trying to grow non-GMO organic produce are finding their fields contaminated by the GMO pollen. And so they're now cut off from markets like Russia and China. It's an absolute disaster. And you're absolutely right. The U.S. just keeps borrowing more money to spend on wars. And that's really where it's all gone. The U.S. is on the exact same path as the Soviet Union, bankrupting the nation to feed this voracious war machine.
Soviet Union and Rome combined, Mike, because people realize, like everybody says, Mike, I have to disagree with a call you had from Missouri who says China should turn their ships around. But then what? You don't have no factories. They're all like filled with asbestos and rusting away.
Yes.
There's no infrastructure built here. China's got it all. They're a creditor nation. That they put their money into building ghost cities. They're still new, though. Our rotting infrastructure's old. Then what? If the ships turn around, they'll find buyers. Like soybeans. Brazil's got soybeans. They can get for bricks. And Mike, on rare metals, this country needs rare earth minerals. We don't have, like you said to the caller, we don't have the ability to have these minerals in abundance. We have to get them, like titanium we get from Russia. So this is a disaster, and we're going to lose, and we're going to lose bad. And then, like you said, they're going to have no choice but to start a world war, and it doesn't matter what the stock market is at the end of that day. They didn't think this through, Mike. Like, I'm looking at what they're picking. Like, they're just throwing stuff out, $100 billion in tariffs. Yeah, but the Chinese are playing like chess with picking certain things that they know they can get replacements for. You know what I mean? Like, we're just playing checkers. It's embarrassing.
It is embarrassing. It is embarrassing. And I've been saying for a long time, the quality of thinking coming out of Washington, D.C., and I don't care how many degrees and plaques on the walls and statues and medals these people have, the quality of thinking is really not very good. They're thinking with their gonads rather than with their brains. And in fact, last night we were watching the news and talking things over, and I turned to Claire and I said, what's really scary is that I know how to run this country better than the people running the country. And she agreed with me. And that's really true. The people running the country are not the people who should be there. There are millions of Americans who are capable of making better decisions on behalf of the American people and the American nation. But everybody in Washington, D.C. is out to line their own pockets, or the pockets of their corporate sponsors, or Israel, or the war machine. And it's another reason why I think ultimately if we can avoid getting into a world war, the ultimate destiny of the United States of America is a Soviet Union-style collapse.
And Mike, just explain to some of your listeners what would happen if the Chinese, I'll take the answer off there, if they jump the treasuries. Because that's, like I said, we're a deadbeat nation, basically. I hate to say it, we're a deadbeat nation. You know, we're not a creditor nation no more. We used to be, we're not anymore. I'll take your answer off your air, Mike. Thanks.
All right, thanks an awful lot. First of all, you need to remember that the United States used to be a creditor nation, and it went from being the world's largest creditor nation to the world's largest debtor nation in the 12 years of Reagan-Bush, because all that money got spent on the Strategic Defense Initiative, which yielded little of any real military benefit. So again, that overspending on war, it destroyed Rome, it destroyed the Soviet Union, it's destroying the United States of America. Now, China is starting to talk about the nuclear option of simply dumping all of their U.S. treasuries all at once. And they probably would take an economic bath, but their economy has the resilience to survive it. And ours does not have the resilience to survive the aftermath. If China were to dump all of her treasuries, all of her U.S. treasuries, it would probably trigger a panic, and other nations would start dumping their treasuries as well. And that would basically mean the treasuries would have no value whatsoever, except, of course, to the Federal Reserve, who expect the American people to work and pay back the treasuries owned by the Federal Reserve at full face value plus accruing interest. But it is our debt that makes a trade war unwinnable. It is our lack of manufacturing ready to step into the product void that makes a trade war a bad idea. And it sounds to me like people were just sitting around the White House, cocktails in hands, and saying, well, we'll show those Chinese, we'll have a trade war with them. And nobody bothered to say, can we actually survive this? Can we actually make it work? It's like they get an idea into their head, and we've seen this with the Democrats as well. They get an idea into their head. It sounds good. It's going to play well on TV. Let's go with it. They go on out and they run a poll, and the majority of Americans say, yeah, let's have a trade war. Well, the majority of Americans probably don't understand the long-term consequences and potential fallout. But what's that old saying? The road to hell is lined with good intentions and paved with sloppy analysis. And that's exactly where we are right now. Look at all of the policy decisions made over the last going on 30 years that sounded really good when they first came on out, and then they turned into utter disastrous failures. Now, getting back to the war zones. Apparently, France wants to reassert its control over Syria. During the colonial era, that was part of the French territories around the world. So France is deploying special forces to Manbij very quickly, and Macron is now assuring the Syrian Kurdistan delegation of his support. This is probably not going to go over very well with Turkey, because only yesterday we were reporting on how President Erdogan was telling France, you have to choose. If you're going to be allies with the Kurds, you cannot be allies with us. If you're going to be allies with us, you cannot be allies with the Kurds. You know, you're either with us or against us. And apparently Macron has decided that he's against Turkey, which creates yet another potential flashpoint there in the Middle East. Turkey, meanwhile, is issuing warnings to the U.S., to Iraq, to the Kurds, pardon me, Cyprus and Greece, not to mention France, over what's going on there at the Syria-Turkey border. Now, it must be remembered to keep things in focus that there's more at issue here right now than merely what happens to the Kurds, because Turkey has now declared that the area around Afrin, which is inside Syria, is now under Turkish control. So Erdogan is definitely one of the biggest loose cannons on deck there. I actually had somebody write in and ask, what the heck does that mean, a loose cannon on deck? Well, if you remember back to the days of sailing ships, warships, the cannons had to be lashed down. Otherwise, when the ship would roll, the cannons would roll back and forth, and they were very heavy and could cause a lot of damage. So a loose cannon on deck is something that's out of control and just smashing into everything at random. We're going to take a break here for some commercials. We'll be back with more news after these few words. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. And before we take this next phone call here, folks, these are serious times. And we are at war. It's a truth between corruption and ethics. It's a war between lies and the truth. It's a war between corporate media and the independent media and we need your help. If you are able to help, the address where you can send a check or a money order, or if you prefer anonymity, and a lot of people do right now, they're scared of all the surveillance. The address is Republic Broadcasting Network, 2251 Double Creek Drive, number 302, Round Rock, Texas, 78664. The phone number to call in and become a recurring subscriber is 800-724-2719, extension 03. And don't forget about the front site promotion. I understand that that's actually doing very well. A lot of people have taken advantage of this amazing opportunity. For a one-time $500 donation to Republic Broadcasting, you get a lifetime Commander membership at the Front Sight Firearms Training Academy. And that is a really good deal. If you look at the top of my main page, the first two articles are stuck there. And one is about the promotional offer, and the other one is the Front Sight webpage itself. And you got to go on in and take a look at the video. And of course, donations are needed, welcome, and greatly appreciated here at whatreallyhappened.com. All right, let's go on back to the phone lines. Dave in Missouri, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Howdy, Mike. Hope your day's off to a blessed start.
Yeah, it is. It's a very beautiful day, which is amazing because the National Weather Service said it was going to be thunder showers.
Wow, well, I can tell you it's a lot colder in Cleveland than it was in New Orleans a few days ago. So we have literally been from the bottom to the top of the country this week. And I got to tell you, right now, this time of year, I'm a Southern boy, so I would have just stayed down there. I want to second what you just said. I mean, your network, the avenues of the truth really are more critical right now than ever before, and we all are under assault. I mean, you can't turn on the TV, you can't turn on a radio station, open a magazine, read a newspaper without your senses and intelligence being completely insulted and assaulted. And so you guys are a bastion, an island of truth in this god-awful polluted sea of propaganda. And really, in my lifetime, I've never seen it to this extent. I doubt you have either. Who would have thought that America would be so backward as it is today? So please, folks, do support RBN. Do support whatreallyhappened.com. Keep Mike on the air. You know his heart. You know where he's coming from, how smart he is, what his motivations are. And we have to have that. That is critical to this time. So please do what you can to support RBN. That's a plug for you. Now, I want to kind of reply to Dustin. And I feel you got to get it. I mean, I spent my whole life in this. So I get his frustration. And my phone died out on me yesterday when I was talking to you. And this was the point I was going to. If we are going into a full-on trade war with China, and then let me caveat it by saying this. You look at China reaching out to the EU. I think all of this thing with Theresa May and the poisoning of the Russian diplomat and his daughter, all of this is a globalist play to try to defeat nationalism, which is on the rise in the world, and really the only prescription for a successful economic stability of a nation these days. Because when you get too interdependent, you see what happens. You lose your ability to support yourself. And then you are dependent on what could potentially be your enemy. So, the globalist traitors like the Clintons, the Bushes, the Waltons, the Rockefellers, so many of them, they really have tied a noose around the neck of the American people. And that noose is held by the Chinese. And so the rest of what I was going to say, and this might be completely off the wall and impossible to do. Okay, so if they dump their treasuries, the treasuries become useless anyway. Why not just zero them out and turn their ships around and put the pressure back on American corporations who exported our wealth to reinvest and do something? Yes, it's going to be a painful process. Yes, it won't happen overnight. But I still believe in the American entrepreneurial spirit. And if, then you come down to finance. Are the banks, the globalist banks, going to finance America's manufacturing recovery? I doubt it, because their whole angle is globalism. So, if everything is going to collapse under the weight of itself anyway, I say beat it to the punch and try to do what we can to pick up the scraps that we've got, create demand. Let our entrepreneurs and our factories can find the financing, the sourcing, the ability to do it, begin to step up and fill the consumer demand. That right now we are all hooked on China like crack babies. And so I'm just going to let it go at that. It may not even be possible. That could lead to a shooting war. We shouldn't be in this situation. But Bill, Hillary Clinton, the Bushes, Obamas, these free trading lunatic traders, they have us in this situation. And either we're going to die an economic death or we're going to die a military death. But either way it goes, we're dead. And so, my only point is to do whatever we can, even if we have to reinvent the wheel, zero out those treasuries, leave them hold garbage paper. What does that mean to us? We want to try the Fed banksters anyway. We want to dissolve that anyway.
Okay, Dave, I'm sorry to cut you off. We got to do another break for commercials. Thank you for the phone call, and I'm going to have some comments when we come on back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And responding to this last caller, we all pretty much understand how great it would be if we start investing in rebuilding our factories and our infrastructure, and we start creating products that other countries want to buy and grow produce other countries want to buy. Unfortunately, it's a little more complex than that. The caller was talking about getting these banks to start investing in factories and so forth. But there's an ugly reality that we've seen throughout history, and that is that banks make much more money off of war than off of peace. Wars are the bankers' richest harvest of debt, and debt is what banks want to have. They want everybody living permanently in debt and permanently paying them interest. And that is one aspect we need to keep in mind. The other one, of course, is, and I mentioned this when Donald Trump was inaugurated, he came into office, there really wasn't that much to work with to try and turn this country around. All of the nation's wealth is locked up with the money junkies who are loath to part with any of it. In fact, if you want to see a good personification of a money junkie, think about Smaug in the Hobbit movies. That's a good idea of the mindset of a money junkie. They don't want to let any of it go. And the rest of our wealth is locked up in the military, which produces nothing of any real value. So we don't really have the capital to put into rebuilding our factories. The factories that are out there, the abandoned and closed factories, they're corroded, they're rusted, they're full of asbestos. In many cases, even the buildings that look like they're in decent shape from outside, the factory machinery inside has been stripped and sold off to other countries for their manufacturing. It took 30 years to get our manufacturing into this decline. It's not going to be repaired overnight. And of course, as far as the GMO agriculture, there's almost no way to take that back. Pollen lasts in the environment for like 2 years. If you grow GMO crops on your farmland and you want to go back to non-GMO, you have to allow the field to lie fallow, which means unused, for 2 years, for 2 seasons. Or you have to basically just burn it, which is what they did over in Hungary. And so we have to face the realization, what do we have to work with? Because of Common Core and the dumbing down of America, we don't really have a large workforce of young people who are able to take those factory jobs and start designing and building new products. We've got a surplus of art history majors, but you can't run an economy on those kind of people. I'm sorry, you can't. I appreciate art. I took art history myself when I was in college. But you got to be practical, and the practical reality is we have very little to work with unless we come up with something so brand new. The rest of the world is going to come on in and say, oh, we want to invest in that. And again, that is why I support a continued expansion of our civilian space program, because that is the civilian technology incubator. Anything that came out of NASA was automatically made available to the public for development and investment. The tech boom of the 70s, 80s, and 90s was born in the Apollo Moon program. And we need something just like it to re-stimulate our economy and get it going again. If we just sit here thinking we're going to compete with the rest of the world to manufacture the products that the rest of the world already knows how to manufacture better than we do, that's a fool's errand. We'll never catch up. These other nations, these other governments are nowhere near as foolish and reckless as Wall Street and Washington, D.C. have been for the last 3 decades. and especially now. I wonder how many of them are on prescription antidepressants. Now, as you know, the leaders of Russia, Turkey, and Iran had a meeting in Ankara to basically try and settle what's going on in Syria down. Basically bring it to an end and say the war in Syria is over. Syria won it. And over in Israel, Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman is out there saying, no, this was wrong. You can't do this. You have to have the permission of the United Nations before you declare peace. And Israel's just upset that if the war in Syria stops, Syria's going to come on down to the Golan Heights and say, this really is our territory, it's our oil, it's our gas, and you need to get on out. That's what Israel's upset about. Forget all this talk about a security buffer zone. That's a constant and repeating ploy by Israel to grab other people's land. They'll build a fence and then they'll say, oh, we need a 100-yard buffer zone behind that. Then they start building on the buffer zone. Then they say, oh, we're sorry, we're going to change where the fence is. We need another 100-yard buffer zone. Buffer zone is Israeli code speak for we're going to grab another piece of land. Now, Britain has just opened a Persian Gulf military base in Bahrain. It's the first time they have done so in 4 decades. And they're basically saying that their concern is maritime security in the region to guarantee the continuation of oil shipments and goods from Asia to Europe. Well, they may be a little bit behind the times because remember, the purpose of that China One Belt, One Road project is to make the shipping of goods from Asia to Europe much faster and cheaper than it would be by ship. Now, obviously, the oil tankers are still going to be there as well. But as far as other goods, not so much. Let's take another phone call here. Ken in New York, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Aloha, Mike. I walked in a bit late. I just got home from work, but you're talking about manufacturing.
Yes.
And in electronics, do we still have the foundry capability for making base components like ICs, resistors, capacitors, all of the base things that you need for electronics manufacturing?
Well, we still have some chip makers here, but the Asian chip makers appear to have gone past them. Israel came in many years ago and bought a major interest in Intel. And so Intel is now making their chips over in Israel. The reality is there are no more companies inside the United States manufacturing television sets. They're all from Asia. Even if it looks like there's an American brand name on there, that's all it is. The American television companies don't manufacture. They'll go to Asia. They'll say, we're going to order so many million of these TV sets, and you put our name on them.
I used to be in that repair field at one time about 30 years ago, and we already saw Zenith going to Mexico.
Yep.
Spain was in Juarez. It was already going away back in the late 70s. But as far as I remember in manufacturing in the last 15 years, almost everything came from China, the Philippines, and I think maybe some of the better stuff was Malaysia and Singapore.
Yeah. But they all do very good jobs there, and you might want to take a close look at some of your products, things that you use every day, and see where they're really coming from, because it is a requirement under U.S. law that the origin of the product be displayed there someplace. And when getting on back to the TV sets, at the end of World War II, there were 36 different companies in the United States of America manufacturing televisions. Now there are none. And basically, corporate CEOs just said, "Well, we don't need to get our hands dirty. You know, we can save money by just licensing the technology overseas." When Seymour Cray was still with us, and he was designing his latest generation Cray computers, he didn't even bother approaching the American chip makers. He went right to Japan because he knew the American chip makers just couldn't produce the high density chips that he needed for his supercomputers.
Well, thank you, Mike.
All right, thank you very much for the phone call. We're going to switch over to Mike in Fort Lauderdale. Aloha, Mike. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Sir, Newsweek 2 hours ago just fired across the bow. They took a federal court judge ruling out of Massachusetts and perverted Scalia's commentary on the Heller case and incorporated it at the U.S. This is Newsweek. U.S. court rules Second Amendment does not protect AR-15. They use the word assault rifles, and they use the term large capacity magazines. And the writer is from New York City and San Francisco, and I saw a picture of him. And well, I'm digressing by getting into that minutia, but clearly a hit piece, clearly designed to make people think that the Miller case does not exist, the Dickey Amendment does not exist, and I cannot find in any way how to counteract this propaganda, make a comment on it, list anything. It's all blocked off.
Well, it doesn't really matter because you're making comment on it here on Republic Broadcasting, and a lot of people are hearing you. And looking at the way gun sales are taking off, nobody's buying the anti-gun propaganda. But you're absolutely right. Newsweek is flat out lying. And there have been numerous court decisions, both at the state and the federal level, saying that the Second Amendment reserves to the American people to carry any bearable arm. And any weapon that is in the possession and use of the of the military forces or the police forces is the right of the people, because the purpose of the Second Amendment is to deter tyrannical government. And if they have all the machine guns and we have starter pistols, obviously we're not in a position to deter tyranny in government. But that's what the government is definitely after.
Yeah, well, they took Scalia's writing for the majority in the Heller case, and they made it like a supposition that what he was inferring was that AR-15s are which runs contradictory to the Miller case. And then they attach as a footnote in bold letters so everyone can see the propaganda. Trump vows Second Amendment will never be repealed after former Supreme Court justice called for change. This is not like maybe militaristic, violent warfare. This is tyranny, soft tyranny. This is warfare, and they're taking the judge's words and twisting it to make people think that the AR-15 is not protected.
Yeah, that's definitely what they're doing. Again, though, there are no exceptions to the Second Amendment, and that Second Amendment is the law of the land. And I think that's why they're going after the Second Amendment now rather than a gun ban, because in the past, every time they've tried to limit the kinds of weapons we, the people, are allowed to have, somebody will come back and they'll file a case and go right on to the Supreme Court and say, Second Amendment doesn't say that. And, the Supreme Court so far has agreed. And so now they're shifting their focus. They want to find a way to repeal the Second Amendment. That is going to be very, very difficult, because in order to do that, Congress has to pass a new amendment. It has to be signed by the president, and then it has to be ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures. Now, the problem there is that we know from past history that the federal government has lied about the ratification of certain amendments. So we have to be on our guard against that. But there's absolutely no question the federal government is very much afraid of the American people. We're getting angry. We're getting frustrated. We're tired of seeing our standard of living in constant decline. We're tired of seeing the hopes for a better future for our children just absolutely sacrificed on the altar of the war god. And people are upset. We get a lot of phone calls in here. I get a lot of emails from people saying, it's time to do something. And I'm trying to be the voice of calm reason here, but I can understand why there are people who are very angry, and the government has a right to be concerned and afraid of the American people. So, yeah, they want to take away the Second Amendment.
It's totally. I get it, Mike. I get why people are upset. This is an act of warfare. What they're doing with this propaganda. It's like Soviet propaganda stuff. One of the phrases that I've used and people, I think, tend to like, and I don't know if you want to use it, you're welcome to, and I don't think that I necessarily incorporate it, but it's the Bill of Rights, not the Bill of Suggestions.
Yes. Yeah, I've heard that before. I've heard that one before. Yeah,
and it's just, it's got, I mean, if they're going to ignore the Constitution, the Second Amendment is the only Bill of Rights, the only thing that we have that's physical and tangible, the only thing that protects your liberty. Everything else is just rhetoric. Once they get rid of that, then, now we have thought crimes, and now we have this, and now we have that. Because all our rights are immaterial. They're not physical. This is the only one.
You raise a good point. None of the other rights actually have a tangible component to them. The right to keep and bear arms does. And that right to keep and bear arms is what enforces the other 9 amendments in that Bill of Rights. But they're under attack as well. Israel wants to get a Palestinian exception to the First Amendment. Our Fourth Amendment right to privacy has just been shredded. And clearly the government has been in violation of the 10th Amendment for quite some time.
I'm a peaceful person, Mike, but and I've been a former law enforcement officer for a long time, and I'm a very peaceful person. But I absolutely, totally understand why things happen in history books, and for us to think that this isn't going south real fast, this is really scary. I hope someone has an injunction against this activist judge. I'd like to find out more about this judge, because they have to cite the Miller case to stop this nonsense immediately.
Well, yeah, the Miller case, the Heller decision, and there have been a whole bunch of court cases that reaffirm the Second Amendment does not limit the kinds of weapons law-abiding citizens are allowed to have. And it makes common sense. If we have an inherent natural right to self-defense, then we have a right to have weapons that are equal to or superior to the weapons in the hands of the criminals. And the criminals are getting military weapons from Fast and Furious. So therefore, we have to have the same for no other reason to defend our homes from illegal invaders.
It's on Newsweek now. If you can think of any way where we can get comments into there to highlight the Miller case, because he took Heller's commentary in the closing and said that he made it look like the AR-15s are not protected based on his statements, and that's not true. It flies in the face of the Miller case. A 5-year-old could do case research and see this.
Well, if Newsweek is blocking off comments, then there's really not that much that we can do about it, but I will take a look and put it up on the website so that people can comment on my website. But yeah, this is a full court press, and I think the reason they're pushing this hard is they're beginning to understand the American people are suspicious of all these shootings being false flags. This insane focus specifically on the AR-15, even though the reality is that the vast majority of murders are committed with handguns. But yeah, they want to take away weapons that give the ordinary American firepower equal to those of the government forces. That's the real agenda here.
I know for a fact on a quicker level, on a smaller county level, I say here in South Florida anyway, all these counties are trying to push they're trying to mirror the same statute to try to destroy the Second Amendment at the county level. And I hope people are ready to start getting active and start voting these people out as fast as we can.
Well, I can imagine that the various pro-gun organizations are going to file a legal challenge as fast as they can. Because, again, the Second Amendment is absolute. Anyway, listen, Mike, thank you for the phone call. We got to take a break for commercials, and we'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here, and let's talk a little bit about the Skripal poisoning case, because this is really turning into an epic fail for Great Britain. And I want to start with something that came through during yesterday's broadcast. The story came on through that apparently Yulia Skripal, or at least that's what we're being told, made a phone call to her cousin Victoria inside Russia. And that apparently during the phone call, questions were raised about just what they had eaten just before they were found ill. And somebody mentioned the possibility that they had been eating fugu. Which, of course, is very, very dangerous food to eat. But it struck me as kind of a little weird claim to make. So this morning I did a little bit of digging. Obviously, you're not going to get fugu in a pizza parlor. It's very hard to prepare. It's very high-end Japanese food. There are some Japanese restaurants around that same neighborhood, including one very high-end one. But as it turns out, fugu is banned across the European Union, and there is only one place you can get it in Great Britain, and that's a special fugu club in London, 77 miles away. So the fugu story is obviously somebody's attempt to sow confusion into the discussion, and that makes this supposed phone call between Yulia and Victoria suspect as well. And I think somebody was reacting to Britain's embarrassing performance at the United Nations Security Council meeting and tried to lay a false trail so people would go on off and talk about that rather than the reality that Great Britain still has absolutely zero evidence to back up their claims that Russia had anything to do with it. Now, Russia is now saying that through diplomatic channels, they have learned that 17 countries that have expelled Russian diplomats were pressured by the U.S. and Great Britain to do so, that they didn't actually want to do it, but pressure was applied to make it look like there's a unified front against those evil Russian fugu fish or whatever is going on over there. But apparently the result of that UN Security Council meeting, observers said that Russia basically demolished all of Great Britain's claims. And I think it was pretty much obvious that that was what was going to happen when Great Britain, again, no proof at all, resorted to simply regurgitating older lies to try and say, well, Russia's really bad, so let's just assume they're being bad again. And they were out there claiming that Russia was occupying Crimea, which is a variation on the theme of Russia stole Crimea. Russia is not occupying Crimea. There are no Russian tanks in the streets of Crimea. There are no Russian soldiers there. Crimea is now a partner with the Russian Federation. And that's the reality. So the propaganda, they're thrashing around and they're not getting traction. And I think that's one of the reasons they're so angry with the independent media, because they can't catapult the propaganda forward like they used to. Now, at the meeting at the Security Council, Russia's telling Britain, you know, you're playing with fire. And Britain is trying to get some kind of a provocation going. Remember, all of these countries, Britain and Europe, they're economically locked in with the United States. If the U.S. economy implodes, their economy will implode, and they, like the United States, desperately need an enemy to blame it all on. Okay. So we're coming up here on the top of the hour. Going to do a station identification. We should be hearing music right about now, I thought. There it is. Okay. Welcome to Professional Radio. We'll be back after station identification. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show, hour number 2. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443. And again, this is a disaster for Great Britain. The whole world knows that Britain had absolutely no factual basis for saying that Russia had anything to do with whatever happened to Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia. But they can't back down. They can't back down and say, oh, well, yeah, we were sorry, we made a mistake. That's one of the downsides of being the leader of a nation. Apologies are politically very expensive, and Theresa May is already very vulnerable. So they're just raising on this busted flush. And they're just making themselves look ridiculous here. Now, over at Cornell, there's a chemistry professor who basically came on out and said that Novichok is so simple that a lot of laboratories can make this stuff. It's not unique to Russia. That anybody could have made this stuff anywhere, including, obviously, Porton Down. And at this point, absent any samples being released for independent verification, we don't even know that it was Novichok. For one thing, the story now is that the Novichok was painted on the doorknob of the Skripal's home. They did not collapse until 7 hours after they'd left home. Novichok works much, much more rapidly than that. There are so many reasons to doubt this story, and especially in the recent history of the Dodgy dossier about Iraq, the Downing Street memo, Saddam's nukes, and so forth and so on. We should doubt it. We should doubt everything being said by any government anywhere absent incontrovertible proof. We should not believe anything that we're told. Beliefs are the chains that hold free minds slaves. From our very youngest age, we're taught to believe over thinking. We're bribed to rely on beliefs. Believe in the rabbit, you get candy at Easter. Believe in the fat man at the North Pole, you get a bicycle. Your own common sense. And just think things through. We know the West wants a war with Russia, China, at least a Cold War to justify bleeding the population for more weapons of war. They may want a real hot war to distract from the fact that all of these Western governments and the money junkies have destroyed the economies of their respective nations. And now they're looking for a scapegoat. They're looking for somebody or something to blame because it worked the last two times. Crash of 1907, World War I. Crash of 1929, World War II. Crash of 2008, and here we are, right on the brink. Now, over in Italy, their ruling parties are saying it was a stupid decision to expel all these Russian diplomats over the Skripal poisoning when there is absolutely no evidence Russia had anything to do with it. And they're absolutely right. The former president of the Czech Republic, Klaus, is also denouncing the expulsion of the diplomats. And he's also denouncing the extradition of the supposed Russian hacker to the United States, where I'm sure after appropriate waterboarding, he will confess to having hacked the DNC servers on behalf of Vladimir Putin. Now, Sergei Lavrov is very concerned about Washington's latest nuclear posture review, which lowers the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons. Now, previously it was threat of imminent nuclear attack or retaliation for nuclear attack, and I guess it's been lowered down to something like the president is having a really bad day. Now, over in Europe, they're starting to armor up. They've taken one of the infantry units and started arming them with upgraded M1A1 tanks at Fort Stewart, Georgia, to get ready for deployment to Europe. Boy, think of how much good could be done for our schools and our hospitals, our roads, our bridges, with all that money that's being poured into these weapons, which are either, hopefully, going to sit unused, complete waste of money, or if they get used, they're just blown up. That's it. You probably ought to go into Google Earth and look for something called the Boneyard. It's out there in the western deserts. It's just square miles of military aircraft that were built and just sat there, were never used in war, and now they're just corroding away in the desert. Talk about a huge, hideous waste of money, not to mention the damage to the environment. We're going to do a shout out now to our on-air affiliates who are just now rejoining our network. Meanwhile, over in Ukraine, President Poroshenko has pledged to sign a decree in May to end the so-called anti-terror operation in Donbass and switch over to the United Forces operation on the territories uncontrolled by Kiev. Very long-winded, but what it signals is an escalation. So there's another flashpoint ready to go. Now, a little bit of good news regarding Iran. The European Union is once again reiterating they are unwilling to change or expand the existing Iran nuclear deal. They think it's just fine the way it is. Iran is not building nuclear weapons. Actually, they weren't to begin with. But Donald Trump, apparently getting more tense phone calls from Benjamin Netanyahu, who is out there saying, no, we've got to expand it. We've got to take away Iran's long-range missiles, because when we invade them, they might shoot back, and they're not allowed to do that under the rules that we just made up. And of course, Iran would be very foolish to surrender their long-range missiles. In fact, any country would be foolish to surrender any of their weapons of deterrence, given the recent history of the United States. The U.S. persuaded Iraq to give up their chemical weapons under UN supervision, saying this will guarantee the peace. Then the U.S. invaded Iraq twice. They demanded Syria give up their chemical weapons, which Syria did, to guarantee peace. And then the U.S. attacked Syria. They convinced Libya to shut down the beginnings of their nuclear program, saying this would guarantee the peace. Then they attacked Libya. Do you see the pattern here? I'm sure you do. You're all very smart, bright, perceptive people. And I'm sure that the governments of places like Iran and North Korea are also just as perceptive. That's the pattern of the United States government. We're going to disarm you so it's easy for us to come in and kill you, whether it's Iranian missiles or North Korean nukes or your sporting rifles. Now, down in Israel, the Land Day protests, the protests for the right of return are continuing along the border between Gaza and Israel. And in order to prevent those snipers from shooting more of the Gazans, the Gazans basically collected up a whole bunch of old used up tires, piled them next to the border and set them on fire to produce this very thick black smoke that the Israeli snipers cannot see through even with their thermographic equipment. Still, the Israelis are firing, and 2 Palestinians were killed and another 250 injured. And interestingly enough, Israel's coming on out screaming about how the burning of the tires is bad for the environment. Look at what those Gazans are doing. It's horrible. They're just damaging the environment. Well, look about the damage to the environment inside Gaza from all the continuous wars and bombing. Continuing the provocations, apparently Israeli soldiers opened fire on Gaza fishermen, injuring 3. And these Palestinian fishermen were sailing along the coast of the Gaza Strip, and they were fired on with live ammunition. One of them is in critical condition. Now, the Israeli forces regularly detain and open fire on unarmed Palestinian fishermen while sailing off the coast of Gaza, fishing, trying to get food. And a part of Israel's blockade of the coastal enclave since 2007, citing supposed security concerns, requires Palestinian fishermen to work within a limited, designated fishing zone, the exact limits of which are decided by the Israeli authorities and tend to fluctuate a lot. So the Gaza fishermen may feel they're inside the designated fishing zone, but it may have been changed, and that justifies them being fired on. Now, this idea that this is all for security concerns is ridiculous. Does Israel really feel threatened by a boatload of fish? And apparently, more than 1,700 Jewish settlers, flanked by heavily armed Israeli forces, have entered the Al-Aqsa compound. It's another provocation. Netanyahu wants to start a new intifada, because then he's got a war that will distract the media and the Israeli people from his corruption problems. Now, I've never been a big fan of Geraldo Rivera, but I have to admit, this was a rare moment of honesty for him, and I have to applaud him. My hat is off to him. Geraldo Rivera was on The Five, and he was asked whether he ever regretted a story he had done. And in reply, he said that he regretted not supporting the Palestinians during the Second Intifada against the Israeli occupation and oppression. And he said he regretted chickening out and not adding his voice as a Jew. And that was a wonderful, honest thing for him to say. And so, of course, the Zionist Organization of America is now demanding Fox News fire Geraldo Rivera. Because you can't say those things. You can't show sympathy for the Palestinians. You can't portray them as humans with feelings. They're just clay pigeons. They're just shooting dummies for the IDF forces to train on. You can't say those other things. I hope Fox News stands firm. I hope they don't knuckle under as so many others have. Meanwhile, as you know, Netanyahu had his own flip-flop a little while ago. He'd worked out this deal with the United Nations where something like 16,000 of the refugees, African migrants, were going to remain in Israel, and the rest would be shuttled off to Europe. And that immediately met with huge protests inside Israel by the Israelis who want all the African migrants gone. Period. End of discussion. And if you say we're being racist, you're just being a Jew-hating anti-Semite who wants Hitler to come back and gas the Jewish babies in the oven. So apparently this has triggered another protest by people in Israel who are in favor of open borders. Israel has their own group of people who are saying the borders should be open. What a mess Soros has started all over the globe. Now, officials from the two Koreas have met to discuss the logistics of the landmark summit. Kim Jong-un and Moon Jae-in are planning on meeting at the Peace House. There's this one little area of the DMZ where there is a secure, safe road that goes through the DMZ, and the Peace House is actually technically inside South Korea. This will be the first time a leader of North Korea has been to South Korea since the two nations were divided. And they're just going over the final details of protocol. Will Kim Jong-un be driven over to the Peace House in a car? Would he prefer to walk with a phalanx of bodyguards? All these little final details. All of these things are worked out well in advance. But this is really, really good, because I think when Kim Jong-un and Moon Jae-in get into that Peace House, they're going to say, the only way we can get the U.S. out of our mutual countries is to be one country. Because North Korea does not want to be attacked, and South Korea wishes the U.S. military would leave. And the U.S. military remains in South Korea on the justification that North Korea is this monster to be feared. And I would be almost willing to bet a jar of kimchi that that's what's going to come out of this meeting. I really think that's what they're going to decide. And maybe they'll just say, we're going to be co-rulers. It wouldn't be the first time. Rome was ruled by a triumvirate during part of its imperial history, where there were 3 co-equal rulers. So that might be the deal that they strike. Remember, everything that you think you know about Kim Jong-un has been fed to you by the same people who insisted Saddam had nuclear weapons. So I hope that works on out, because that would be one less area where war could break on out. Down in Ghana, apparently the people there are protesting this new U.S. defense deal, where the U.S. Made a deal with the Ghana government saying that Washington would inject $20 million into the country's military. I guess it's a small military. But this would in turn grant the U.S. unimpeded access to military facilities, and the people of Ghana are seeing this as an affront to their sovereignty. And yes, it is. We're going back to a neo-colonialist age here. Let's take some phone calls here. Nick in England, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Oh, hello, Mike. Thanks for taking my call. I rang you about a week ago and I had a little chat about what was going on with this poisoning of the Russian spy here in the UK, and you've talked about it a lot, and just mentioning it just now. And I don't want to repeat everything that you've said recently, but I wanted to just focus on, I was watching the BBC last night, and the coverage of the UN, the Security Council, and the BBC correspondent, they were just talking that, Russia was just resorting to mockery and ridicule and sarcasm, and it was theatre. Meanwhile, the UK were reciting facts and leaving it to the international organizations to investigate, and Russia was trying to sow seeds of doubt, and they're the victim. And then the Moscow correspondent said, and all the conspiracy theories that originate from here, i.e. Moscow, is just trying to sow seeds of doubt. And I mean, this propaganda was just extraordinary. I mean, saying that somebody like me, I don't have the intelligence to work anything like this out myself.
Yes, you do.
And that I'm just being,
Yes, you do.
Well, not according to the BBC, I don't. According to the BBC, I'm just being played by Russian propaganda. It's embarrassing. It's just embarrassing. I have to pay for this in our taxes. Everyone in Britain is obliged to pay about £140, £150 a year if they own a TV to fund the BBC. And so, I'm funding the BBC to lie to me. It's just bizarre.
We do the same thing here in the United States. I mean, over-the-air broadcast is on the wane. We're all paying for our cable service. We're required to have CNN. I wish I could get it turned off. But yeah, absolutely. We're paying to the media to lie to us, whether it's satellite radio like XM or Sirius rather, or cable TV. We're paying to be lied to, and the government is using our tax money to lie to us as well. And I've read that Constitution, and that's not in there. And the 10th Amendment says they're not supposed to just decide that they can do that.
just going back to watching our UK ambassador to the UN, it was just an embarrassment hearing her talking about it's like Russia demanding the right to a sample. It's like the arsonist is turning the firefighter wishing to investigate his own fire. I mean, we're obliged as a matter of law under the treaties we've signed to give them the sample. And, Britain gave the world the rule of law. It's one of the things that we should be really proud of. And we're just completely turning our back on that and just ignoring this. I mean, I thought that the Russian ambassador, you've mentioned before the Russian sense of humor, and I thought we all know about British intelligence going back to Tony Blair and so on. I thought he was, absolutely outstanding in a lot of what he said.
Yes.
But to just be ignored, that we have this obligation that we won't give them any samples, it's just embarrassing. But I'm just wondering if there's something I'm missing here, because, the comment that you came out with a little while ago that Putin said, look, if we wanted to kill this guy, he'd be dead, which I thought was a really brilliant comment. But I'm just thinking, if they really wanted to bump him off for whatever reason, I can't imagine why they'd want to do that, but they just get some local goon to do it and do a Seth Rich on him. I mean, why on earth would they go and do something, mix up some lethal concoction, bring it from somewhere in Russia, through some sort of diplomatic bag or something?
You're absolutely right here.
Throw it all over the letterbox.
Okay, Nick, stay on the line. Yep. We got to do a commercial break. I'm going to come right back to you after these few words. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show, and we're talking with Nick in England. And Nick, you brought up a couple of really good points. First of all, there's no reason for Russia to have gone after this guy at this particular time. What Skripal did in terms of being a double agent was years and years and years ago. And Putin was dealing with his re-election. He's still dealing with the World Cup. There was no motive for it to happen right now. And you're also absolutely correct. Intelligence agencies all over the world have long ago developed methods of assassinating people that leave no trace, that make it look like it's a heart attack, or they can fake a car accident, or something like that. And so this idea of using a nerve agent that is synonymous with Russia it makes it very obvious this was a false flag situation.
If the UK government's right in what they're saying, then the Russians are incredibly incompetent and utterly stupid. There's no other explanation.
Well, the Russians are not incompetent, and they're not utterly stupid. No. Theresa May has got herself into a real corner because nobody is buying this. Most of the non-aligned governments around the world are calling bovine excrement on this one, but she can't back down. And what they're trying to do right now is just try and get at least the British people to go along with it. But from what I'm getting in my emails and phone calls like yours, nobody's buying this nonsense. We have been lied to way too many times, and people are just skeptical, which is a healthy thing. And they're thinking this through for themselves. They're understanding why this doesn't make any sense. If you want to look for a motive to kill Skripal right now, it's because of his connection to Christopher Steele and that dossier that the Democrats and Hillary bought and paid for to try and use to smear Donald Trump.
Well, you've often in the last few weeks I've heard you talk about the quality of thinking coming out of Washington and the quality of the politicians there. Well, I just think our politicians here, I think they're pygmies. I think they are really feeble, the quality of thinking and so on. It's an embarrassment what they're doing now. And I thought the Russian ambassador, the way he mentioned, repeated a lie a million times or whatever he said, people start to believe it. This is straight out of the Goebbels book. I thought it was really, really well put. And we are hearing it just time after time after time. And, the repetition of, we're right. How dare you question us? Everything we say is, we know what's going on because we've seen all sorts of evidence, but we can't possibly tell you what it is. You have to trust us. It's pathetic.
Well, nobody should trust government. Nobody should ever trust government or, for that matter, the corporate media. everybody who was ever double-crossed, lied to, betrayed, or used had it done to them by somebody they were told they could trust. And there's a life lesson embedded in there.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I've heard politicians here being interviewed on TV programs and so on, and they're being asked straight, do you trust the security service? And they say yes. I mean, we've had thousands of pages and millions of pounds spent investigating the Iraq War, and as sure as night follows day, so obvious to anyone here with half a brain that we were disgracefully lied to, and that the security services and everything been politicized. And it's like it never happened. It's bizarre. I just think it just feels surreal. I think I'm in a madhouse. Honestly, it just makes no sense at all.
And unfortunately, the inmates are in charge of the asylum.
Yeah. Anyway, that was all I had for you today. I watched this. It was just excruciating embarrassment for my country. I'm proud of being English in this country and its traditions, but watching this is it's a disgrace, absolute disgrace.
Well, one can be proud of their country, and they can be proud of the people of that country, and still be ashamed of the government. And that's certainly the situation with me here in the United States of America. I'm sure it's probably true for the vast majority of people around the world. I remember back when George W. Bush was president, he was trying to sell this idea saying that you can't say that you love your country but distrust your government. He was trying to blend the two. Absolutely not. The government is the hired help of we the people. They're supposed to be the janitors of the place, not the bosses.
Yeah, they're supposed to serve us. That's true, supposed to, yeah. Oh, well. Anyway, well, that's all I had for you today, Mike. Thanks very much.
All right, thanks an awful lot. We're going to let you go. We're coming up at a commercial break, so I'm going to hold off taking any more phone calls. But until the commercial break, here's a very alarming story. Apparently, back during World War II, the U.S. government used black soldiers as human guinea pigs in chemical experiments. And about 60,000 U.S. soldiers were enlisted in a classified chemical weapons testing program in which soldiers were enclosed in gas chambers and exposed to various chemicals. And one of the surviving veterans of that, Roland Edwards, said that they were told they were being tested to see what effect the gases would have on black skins. And we're going to take another break for commercials. Back with more phone calls after these few words. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. We're going to go back to the phones here. John in Little Rock, thank you for waiting so patiently. And what's on your mind today?
Yeah, I want to talk about Fox News. And I want to talk about Sean Hannity and Geraldo. You see, Fox News is owned by the House of Saudi Arabia. So Sean Hannity and
I thought it was owned by Rupert Murdoch.
It's partly owned. He sold one share to the House of Saudi. Look it up.
Okay, one share.
Well, you see, they got to be careful what they say. They can't say nothing bad about Saudi Arabia. Otherwise, their checks will get cut. You feel me?
Okay.
Yeah, you finally figured it out now. That's all I want to say.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the phone call. We're going to let you go and switch over to Lenny in California. Aloha, Lenny. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
One share, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm. My figure is about the same as yours, Mike. All right. But anyway, I want to give what I have termed an unconfirmed report on the real reason of the Skripal case. And when I say the unconfirmed, I mean the reason the Western so-called media won't report it. All right? And that is at the end of the Eastern Ghouta assault by Syria, Russia, Hezbollah, okay, they found, I think right at about a total of 11 Israeli Mossad, British MI6, and CIA operatives there. Now, they had also found them in Aleppo when Syria and Russia and Hezbollah took out Aleppo to clean Aleppo of the terrorists. Mm-hmm. But at that time, they negotiated terms for them to be released. But after they bombed the Syrians about a month ago with Russians involved, they bombed the Russians too, they said no more. Because at that time, Syria and Iran were against negotiating that deal. Russia went ahead with it, but after they ended up killing Russians the second time around, Putin has said no more. And at that moment, when they could not negotiate those operatives out of Eastern Ghouta and Syria, Russia, and Iran are holding them for a heavier trump card to be played later. After they found them there, that's when the Skripal case broke, and that's when the fires broke out in Russia, burning up that theater full of women and children. And that's when 4 more fires, if you notice, were set right after that. They went insane.
Yeah. No, I was very suspicious about those fires inside Russia. First of all, that they were happening, and second, why they were being given so much media coverage.
Exactly. So, and that's the thing, all to make Putin look bad, but also the Skripal case was also right before Putin's election. So they just they had nothing else they could do but go after Skripal and make Putin look bad, but they were doing anything to get Putin and the Russians and Syrians and Iranians to release those operatives. But they haven't been released, and I hope they don't. I hope they parade them before the world one day. With that being said, Mike, I got a bone to pick with you.
Okay.
Because it just irks me, man, every time I hear you say it. And so I'm going to put it in the form of a question. What's a Gazan?
I'm sorry?
What is a Gazan? You keep referring to the Palestinians as Gazans. What is a Gazan?
Well, it's somebody who's entrapped inside that giant open-air prison called Gaza, and I'm not the only one who uses that particular term.
But yeah,
Palestinians also includes the people in the West Bank.
Exactly, but do we call Palestinians Gazans now? I never heard that term before here the last year or so.
No, I've seen it in several places, and that's why I started using it, because it does specify a subset of the Palestinians who are trapped inside Gaza.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, but, out of respect for the Palestinians and their identity being wiped off the face of the earth, I would still like to refer to them as Palestinians in Gaza.
Point taken.
I appreciate it.
Okay, anything else?
That's it, sir. Thank you.
All right, thanks an awful lot. We're going to let you go, and we had one of our callers who got tired of waiting and hung up, so the phone lines are now open. Okay, the U.S. State Department is okaying a potential $2.5 billion, with a B, sale of military drones to Germany, which of course is good news for Northrop Grumman and Airbus Defense and Space. So they're selling the hardware all over. And obviously, all this tension is really good for arms sales all around the world. The U.S. defense contractors are very happy about all this. We saw exactly the same thing during the Cold War of the 50s and 60s. They would loot the American taxpayer to develop these weapons. Then they'd turn around and sell those weapons for a profit to other countries. And the American people did not get to share in any of those profits. It's quite a sweet deal for the defense contractors, and it is one of the reasons why Eisenhower did warn us about the military-industrial complex in his farewell address. Eisenhower was one of the most anti-war presidents we've ever had, because he had been in war, he'd seen the horrors of war up front, and as he got older, he definitely mellowed, and he went the other direction. His Cross of Iron speech is absolutely beautiful, and if you have not read it, you need to hunt it down and take a look at it. Now, a lot of people are talking about this recent revelation that Sinclair Broadcasting basically constrains all of its own TV stations to report the exact same news in exactly the same way. And a lot of people are very upset about that, because we were all raised with this idea that the reason we have multiple TV stations and multiple newspapers and multiple magazines is to preserve a diversity of opinion, so that we can basically look at differing points of view and decide for ourselves what to think. And more, corporate media is becoming this giant monolith with only one point of view being presented. So there is an article that came out of Motherboard over at Vice.com, saying that part of the problem is we're seeing the result of decades of failing to take media consolidation worries seriously. Now, again, a long time ago, there were laws that limited how much media any one entity could own. They didn't want any marketplace dominated by one point of view. And so there were laws that said if there were 3 newspapers in a city, they had to have 3 different owners. If there were 5 radio stations, they had to have 5 different owners, and so forth and so on, to preserve that diversity of opinion. But starting, well, really accelerating, during the first Iraq War, the U.S. government went to the larger media corporations and said, we'll make you a deal. If you will embed your reporters with our military forces and report on the Iraq War the way we tell you to, we will rescind those limitations and you can start gobbling up your small competitors left and right, which is precisely what happened. And at the time it was happening, media critics were saying, this is a threat to a diversity of opinion. And we have seen that those concerns were justified. And now a lot of people are very worried that Sinclair is trying to acquire Tribune for $3.9 billion, which would give Sinclair ownership of more than 230 broadcast TV stations, reaching 72% of the American public. Now, Sinclair has already been widely criticized for news that tends to be facts optional on a good day. It's a propaganda outlet, and a lot of people are very concerned. But of course, that's right why people are turning away from the corporate media, and they're coming over here to the independent media. They're going to Republic Broadcasting, they're going to whatreallyhappened.com, they're going to all these various websites and over-the-internet broadcasters to find out what's really going on, because they value that diversity of opinion. If you listen to RBN a lot, you will find that the various hosts have different points of view on different subjects. And that's what's supposed to happen, to preserve that diversity of opinion so that you can decide for yourself what makes sense, as opposed to having everybody on all the Sinclair stations saying exactly the same thing. So you've got no sounding board, you've got no alternative possible suggestions that you might consider. Now, Jerome Corsi has a new book out called Killing the Deep State, The Fight to Save President Trump, and it is a runaway bestseller. It debuted last week at number 10 on the nonfiction hardcover list compiled by Nielsen Bookscan, the book industry's only nationally recognized sales tracking list. However, over at the New York Slimes, on their bestseller list, the book does not appear, even though it is outselling books that did make the bestseller list. Of course, we know that the New York Times bestseller list is rigged, because the bookstores that the New York Times relies on for sales information are known, so that public relations firms hired by the book's publisher can go into those stores or send a bunch of people into those stores and buy lots of copies and rig the numbers that way. Let's take another phone call here. Lisa in Pennsylvania, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hello again. I called yesterday as well. I was wondering, I just wanted to get your opinion on something and maybe mention something as well. Do you think that Israel or Zionists or whatever, I'm just going to say Israel, do you think they've gone a little too kind of insane lately, and maybe people are opening their eyes to what's really going on over there? It seems like they've gotten very bold in terms of wanting legislation that you can't criticize, or you can't be a member of the BDS movement and different things like that. I'm wondering, do you think that could be a good thing, and maybe people are going to wake up to the reality?
Oh, absolutely. There's no question. I mean, the global condemnation of this recent confrontation between the Palestinians in Gaza and Israel, I equate it to Amritsar, when the British shot a bunch of Indian protesters. And historians have said that was the moment where British control over India began to slip, leading to their eventual Indian independence. And yeah, the fact that Israel is in here openly buying our politicians, a lot of Americans find that very offensive. The fact that Israel is in fact pushing for censorship laws in this country. Americans are proud of their Bill of Rights. They're proud of that heritage of freedom and the right to freedom of speech. And they see Israel as an enemy to those values we hold most dear to in this country. And so, yeah, people are waking up, and they're getting really tired, and they're not going to be silenced by being, called an anti-Semite anymore, because they realize it is just a trick to get you to shut up.
Right, exactly, as that lady on Amy Goodman pointed out a long time ago. But the person who awakened me to this was Miko Pellet. I'm not sure if you're familiar. He's an author. His father was a general, and he wrote a book called The General's Son. And I know that Richie Allen has interviewed him, and I know you're friends with Richie, but I bet you $1, because that's all I have to offer right now, that he would probably be interviewed by you if you were interested. He's very much an activist for the Palestinian rights, even though he was raised Zionist.
I think I've heard his name, and I've heard of the book, and I'll ask Richie to get me the contact information.
Okay. All right, well, that's really all I have. I just hope something good comes out of this, because it's so very sickening, the whole situation over there.
Yes.
And trying to explain to people, I do have something good on my side in terms of that, is that I used to practice the religion of Judaism, so coming from me, it seems a little less harsh. Do you know what I'm saying? Whenever I explain what's going on, they think, well, Lisa must know something about it. She, to speak out this way. So yes. I do the best I can.
Well, thank you very much for your help.
Works. Well, thank you.
All right, have a good day. We're going to let you go. And before we take this next phone call, because we are coming up on the top of the hour and the Lady Claire, there's one story I really did want to get out today. Yesterday we were talking about this 78-year-old man in England. He was at home. His wife was upstairs sleeping, and two young men broke into his home. And in trying to defend his home, he stabbed one of them, who died. And the police arrested him on suspicion of murder. Well, whether it's the public backlash, outcry, or just somebody higher up in the ranks who said, you got to be kidding me, the man has been released. There are no charges. They just let him go. And finally, some common sense. On the other hand, over in France, 3 off-duty soldiers stopped a woman from being robbed, and for some reason, they wound up being arrested. The robber was an illegal immigrant, but for some reason, it's almost like there's an agenda out there where we should just accept being victims, whether it's of criminals, whether it's of the government, whether it's of the media, that we don't have a right to fight back and defend ourselves, that we should just be totally dependent on the government for our safety, which we know is a joke. We learned that one down there in Parkland. All right, going to take another phone call here. Curtis in Nevada, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hi, Mike. I wanted to comment about how we've seen Trump several times since make a statement that was unexpected and then immediately get walked back, okay? I wanted to, obviously, this last thing about Syrian troops, sending our troops home from Syria, and we saw the backlash he got, or I don't know if it's, and from what I think is that Trump is being inconsistent and he's being unpredictable. He's been doing that ever since he started, and I think by necessity. I think he's doing that purposely because he's in a war, and if he's predictable, and it's a fatal thing to be predictable.
I disagree.
I
disagree. You don't want to be predictable in the conduct of war, but the message that Trump is sending out with all of this is that he's a weak leader, and that is even more dangerous than being predictable.
Maybe so. That's possible, but I like to believe. Okay, first of all, I don't think Trump is running the show. I hope he's not. I'm going by my belief that the MI and generals in the military are running the show, and Trump is the front man. So one of two things could be happening when he does this, and he's done it several times, is that, number one, he could be actually jumping the script, okay? And his own handlers are walking up and say, wait a minute, mister, we're not there yet. We don't have that kind of leverage yet. Or number two, he could be doing this purposely. Because when you make a statement
I don't
like,
think
I'm
so.
bringing back the truth.
I don't think so. Curtis, we're going to have to let you go. We got to take a break for commercials, and we'll be back after these words from our sponsors. Aloha America, welcome back to our show here, and I just got an email from a listener in response to the caller who said Saudi Arabia owned Fox News. Apparently this person went on out and took a look at the actual records, and Rupert Murdoch does own 80% of Fox News, so I don't think Saudi Arabia is really in a position to exert all that much pressure, certainly not compared with Israel. All right, we're going to take one more phone call, then we're going to close the lines for a while as the Lady Claire comes on. Mike in Chicago. Aloha, Mike. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, yeah, we were talking.
Okay, we've got a real bad phone connection. Can you put your mouth closer to the microphone and try again?
Oh, I might not be able to talk. Somebody was telling me that the Palestinians, if you look at the word, you know what the word race means. It means, what Arabic, white, black, Chinese. But what he's saying was that the Palestinians are not a race.
Well,
and
the Palestinians are the direct genetic descendants of the biblical Hebrews. Okay, Mike, we're having some real technical issues here, so thank you for the phone call. We're going to let you go, and we're going to close the phone lines for a while here. Now, as you know, it was a real rough day on the stock market. The reality of these coming tariffs and sanctions is really starting to take hold. At one point, the Dow was down about 700. The plunge protection team tried to get it up a little bit before the close, but I can imagine that the investor class is not going to be getting a lot of sleep over this coming weekend. The U.S. is considering an additional $100 billion with a B dollars in tariffs on Chinese imports. And China is vowing to fight the U.S. at any cost. And it's all about the petro-yuan. This is why this is all ramping up right now, is the Federal Reserve sees, and for that matter, all the European private central banks see the petro-yuan as a threat to their hegemonic domination of the world. And they're trying to find some way to put pressure on China to back down. And China's not going to back down. In fact, China is now starting to talk about the nuclear option of simply dumping all their U.S. treasuries at once. And they have a huge amount because of the trade imbalance. Money flowing out of this country to China, something like 10 to 1 to money flowing in. China's been taking that money and buying the treasuries for future investment. But at this point, they may be realizing that a treasury bond really isn't that good of an investment anymore, and they may be ready to weaponize them. And in fact, Donald Trump may be thinking this could happen because Trump is now warning investors we may take a hit and that they should be prepared for pain in the market. But he says, we'll be stronger for it. That's like saying that if you hit yourself in the head with a hammer, you'll be smarter afterwards. I don't think so. We're going to take a break for station identification. We'll be back with the lovely Lady Claire after these few words. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here, hour number 3. And for those of you watching on YouTube, this gorgeous creature just slamming her headphones into place right now is the lovely Lady Claire, who joins us on Friday, hour number 3, with her unique perspective on the world. And so, Claire, what would you like to start with?
Well, our ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, has done it yet again. She has tap danced on her tonsils, and were I her tonsils, I would be getting annoyed. Because what she did a speech yesterday, and it was a lecture at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina. And the speech was called Confronting Today's Global Governance Challenges. And what she did...
Now look at the hubris there.
Yeah.
She's coming from the position that the U.S. governs the world.
Yeah, and she accused Iran of supporting terrorism, which I find more than slightly hysterical. and violating the terms of the 2015 historic nuclear agreement, and went on to say that the Europeans are closing their eyes on this, but added that the United States would not do that. You know, Mike, sometimes I literally ache at the collective foreign power push to read Israeli lies of this government. Now, one thing I know about the people at the IAEA who are monitoring what Iran is doing, and the one thing I do know is that they are very smart people. And if these people say to me and the world that Iran is complying with the P5+1 agreement, I seriously doubt that either Ambassador Haley or President Trump can actually come up with evidence to the contrary. And yes, you know, I'm not diminishing Nikki Haley. She does have a college degree. However, that degree is a BS in accounting, not atomic science.
Well, it takes a lot of BS to be ambassador to the United Nations, I would say here.
Yeah.
It has to be remembered, it is the United States that is in violation of the P5+1 deal, because they were supposed to release Iran's money. They didn't release it all. And then they promptly turned around and threw more sanctions on top of it.
Yeah.
So it's the United States that's acting very much in bad faith here. Plus, the United States is in violation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, because according to that treaty, the United States is supposed to help Iran develop peaceful uses of nuclear power.
Yeah.
Principally nuclear power plants. And if the United States were really worried that Iran was building a secret bomb factory under the power station, the way Israel has under Dimona, going on in and helping to pour the concrete and run the piping and do the wiring is a really good way to make sure it is just a power station.
Then they'll know. And Michael, you have to ask yourself, if you're an intelligent person, why are they even trying with this stuff? Well, it's obvious that they're looking to create a justification for a U.S., Israeli, Saudi decap strike on Tehran in order to facilitate regime change. But there is one thing I would like to politely point out to all three governments, and it is the 6,000-pound gorilla napping on the Bösendorfer Grand at this moment. And that 6,000-pound gorilla is going to be Russia, because if Iran gets attacked, Russia will come to its aid militarily.
Russia's already said they were going to do that.
You know, and we have seen in the war theater in Syria that Russians do have weapons that work remarkably and magnificently well. And I'd like to move over now to the issue of jobs and economy. Now, the latest statistics indicate that there were 310,000 part-time jobs added. But full-time job lost, 311,000. That's pretty striking.
Of course, what you get in the corporate media is they'll talk about, we've created all these jobs. They don't mention they're just part-time jobs, and they don't mention the jobs that are being lost.
Yeah.
And again, you cannot reconcile the government's claims of single-digit unemployment with a 60% participation rate of the entire U.S. workforce. The two just don't line up. They're not even in the same time
They're
zone.
mutually exclusive. So no matter what the talking heads on television are saying, this country is not in any kind of a real recovery whatsoever. And these numbers absolutely prove it. And as of April of last year, there were 1.6 million. Let me run by that number again. 1.6 million unemployed Americans who have been out of work for 6 months or longer. And nearly 1 million have been jobless for over a year.
Even those numbers are understating the reality. It's actually closer to 90 million.
Yeah.
And even CNN reported on that once, just once, and we never heard it again.
Now, I saw something out of Zero Hedge that really kind of concerned me. And the headline was, "Stocks tumble as China urges Americans to rise up against unscrupulous president." Thought that was a little bit odd.
Well, the rhetoric is definitely escalating because Donald Trump starts this whole trade war with tariffs. Then China comes back with tariffs. And then Trump says, well, China's retaliatory tariffs are unfair.
Yeah.
And so now we're basically into this chest-thumping phase of this escalating situation.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we're going to do a quick shout out to our on-air affiliates who are just now rejoining the network. And
one thing that really concerned me, Mike, is that China's Xinhua News, which is basically the mouthpiece for the Chinese Communist Party, has sparked concerns as an op-ed piece called for open rebellion against Trump.
Well, we might find that shocking,
Yeah.
but if you go back and you study all of the so-called color revolutions
Mhm.
And the U.S. regime changes, they're preceded by the planting of stories in the media
Yeah.
that the people of Syria should rise up against their leader. The
Yeah.
people of Ukraine should rise up against their leader.
Mhm. Fill in the blanks.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what concerns me is that a war of words can escalate very quickly.
They just had that on Fox News. 103,000 jobs added this week.
Yeah.
And they don't talk about the jobs that were lost.
And they don't talk about the kinds of salaries of these jobs either. Were they minimum wage?
Yeah, I mean, that's been a big part of the decline of the American standard of living, is that people have lost jobs with decent wages and salaries that allowed them to pursue the consumer economy, and they've been forced to accept jobs at a much lower rate of pay. And we're being driven downward and downward into third world standard of living, which is part of the globalist agenda.
Mhm.
Plus, mix in with that, we're in a wartime economy. All of the wealth is being sucked out of the country to feed the war machine.
Yeah. And here's another article from Global Research. It's a Canadian blog, pretty sober. And the writer is an MD. And the title of this article is Psych Drugs and Guns Don't Mix. And what this guy says is that the most infamous of those psychiatric drug-induced criminal behaviors happens to be the uniquely American epidemic of mass school shootings, of which the Parkland, Florida shooting is just one of the most recent ones. And not so usually well publicized are the acts of asocial behavior, poor judgment, which includes actions as impulsive thefts, inappropriate sexual conduct, physical assaults, homicidal thinking, suicide, drug-induced psychotic episodes, etc., etc., etc. And I have a little caution to say to anyone who has teenagers right now, and you've gone to your doctor and they're saying, well, we really think we should put your kid on an SSRI medication. Please, before you follow through on that, look at the following website, www.ssristories.com.
Yes, we have a permanent link to that from my own article on these medications. And Claire, you hit a point that we should amplify on. This idea of mass school shootings is unique to the United States.
Mhm.
It's unique to the present gun grabber age. You have other countries where guns are quite common and prevalent.
Switzerland,
Israel, many countries where guns are just an accepted fact of life. They don't have these school shooting issues.
No.
Okay, so there's something going on here. Now, of course, we know that a lot of these shootings appear to be set up and allowed to happen, encouraged to happen, to push that gun grabber agenda. And the reason they're not spending a lot of time on that YouTube shooting is because it was an Iranian woman, not a white male. Remember, they were pushing that whole thing about the mass shooters are always white men. No, they're not.
No.
And of course, she didn't use an AR-15, she used a handgun.
And the other thing that you need to ask your medical professional, and this is a question that I have no problem asking anymore after I got caught up in a kerfluffle. And that question is, are you being paid by the pharmaceutical company making this medicine to prescribe it? Because there are ways to find out.
That's a very common problem. We ran a story here, I think earlier in the week, about the huge amounts of money doctors are being paid to prescribe opioids.
Yeah. And I got caught up in it myself. I was on some medication, and I didn't realize that the doctors who were prescribing it were actually being compensated financially for prescribing the drug. And it wasn't managing my pain as effectively as it could have been.
It wasn't even supposed to be a pain medication. It was being prescribed off-label. It was very expensive.
And I mean, I'm lucky I survived with my life.
The withdrawal was terrible.
It was pretty grim. So if your doctor is talking to you about this for your son or daughter, just tell them, I think I want to wait a while and do the due diligence and then ask those questions. The doctor is not going to be happy with you, but I think as clients of a physician who's part of the medical industrial complex, we have the right to know.
You know, just because a kid is moody doesn't mean he's mentally ill or depressed.
No.
Kids in adolescence, they go through mood swings. It's part of that whole transitioning to a whole new hormonal, endocrinal reality. Which, of course, Margaret Mead said didn't exist. But it does. And everybody goes through it. I went through it. Claire went through it. You went through it. It doesn't justify being medicated. When I was a kid, there was no such thing as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It was called the teacher is boring me.
Yeah, exactly. I'd sort of like to bop over to Europe for the moment. And this again comes from Global Research out of Canada. And the video is titled The Art of Warfare, U.S.-NATO Military Occupation of the EU. The Schengen area is being taken over by NATO forces. And the European Commission presented the action plan on what they called military mobility on the 28th of March, right, the last week. And they're stating that by facilitating military mobility within the EU, explained the foreign representative of the Union, Federica Mogherini, we can be more effective in reacting when challenges arise. And Mike, she didn't use the word Russian aggression, but you know that that was the undertone.
That's definitely going to be the undertone.
Yeah.
They're garrisoning Europe.
Yeah.
Everybody is getting ready for the big party that's on the way.
Yeah. And apparently this action plan was decided not by the EU, but by the Pentagon and NATO. In 2015, General Ben Hodges, commander of the U.S. ground forces in Europe, called for the establishment of a military Schengen area so that, to face alleged Russian aggression, U.S. forces could move more quickly from one European country to the other without being slowed down by national regulations and customs
They're just going to drive wherever they want to drive.
You know, the actual voiceover is in Italian, and the subtitles are in English, but it's very clear to see what the plan is. More demonization of Russia, ultimately leading up to a shooting war against it. You know, I would love to see a potential meeting between Trump and Putin de-escalate the preparations for war in Europe, but there has been so much that's been invested into it. I'd love to know that such a meeting might ratchet things down, but Mike, I've got to tell you, I'm not sure at all.
Well, I mean, just look at this last week here. I mean, Trump could go into that meeting with the very best of intentions and come on out and say, yeah, we're going to back on down. But as we saw with his announcement that we were going to get out of Syria, he's not in control.
No.
He's not calling the shots. His advisors said we got to stay in Syria. The Pentagon said we got to stay in Syria. All those military contractors said we have to stay in Syria. And Benjamin Netanyahu called him up and said we have to stay in Syria.
Yeah.
And so, you know, Trump and Putin could come out of that meeting, you know, their arms around each other's backs, you know, and saying we're the best of friends now. And then the military-industrial complex will say, no, we've got to have that war with Russia. Wall Street will say, we've got to have that war with Russia.
Yeah.
And Trump will back down. He is telegraphing to the world that he's actually a very weak leader, and he is not in control. And that, I think, is going to scare a lot of people. If anything, it brings us closer to the possibility of a nuclear exchange. Because these other countries that have nuclear weapons, they don't know who's in charge. They can't see the decision-making process, and that's going to make them a lot more afraid than they are right now.
Yeah. And speaking of military, there has been an evaluation done by Russian intelligence and was published today in Sputnik. Mike, we've got almost 500,000 troops in the Asia-Pacific region?
Yes.
Yikes. 200 military facilities and 400,000 troops.
So we can build military bases all over the world, but we can't build new schools or hospitals.
Right, right. It's just, to me, it's a criminal neglect of the American citizen. Yeah. Criminal neglect.
We already did this story.
Okay, well, I have a little background that I wanted to share. I know that you did it. And the UK has opened a permanent military base in Bahrain, that beacon of democracy, by carbonate of soda. And the ceremony was attended by Bahraini Crown Prince Salman bin Hamad Al Khalifa and Britain's Prince Andrew. So the British monarchy has put their seal of approval on this. And so the translation is that the UK is, as is the US, formally supporting yet another Sunni tin pot dictator in the Middle East, whose views on any potential Shia human rights mean that they have none. And there have been demonstrations in Bahrain. They've been very peaceful demonstrations, as the Shia Bahrainis have been advocating to see a constitutional monarchy, which doesn't sound like that big a deal in this part of the 21st century.
Well, Hawaii had a constitutional monarchy.
Yeah,
Hawaii's last two kings were actually elected.
Voted, yeah.
Yes.
And so how has the monarchy and government been reacting to this? They have not only been putting peaceful demonstrations down with extreme prejudice, its police and military have violently attacked and tortured the peace demonstrators, and the first responders who kept them alive then sentenced them in kangaroo courts to outrageous sentences, which had no justification in the facts of their actions.
So Bahrain is treating these people the way Israel's treating the Palestinians.
Oh, absolutely. And the British monarchy, represented by Prince Andrews, has put its stamp of approval on this behavior by the Bahraini government to represent him as their front man for this event. And I am sorry, Prince Andrew, but in light of the way the Al Khalifa monarchy is treating its people, you should be ashamed of yourself for participating in this event. The UK could have found some other place to establish a larger military presence in the Middle East, which at least has some notion about and protection of human rights.
Well, unfortunately, Iran said no.
Yeah, I know. That would have been my first thought, but yeah. I'd like to also look at what is going on with the U.S. drone strike in Yemen. And apparently, in 2017, the U.S. military said that it carried out more than 120 strikes in Yemen, more than 3 times as many as 2006. And there is the Mwatana Organization for Human Rights, and they've been documenting the impact of U.S. drone strikes in Yemen through detailed research. And they investigated 8 drone strikes and ground operations and found that the U.S. operations were responsible for the deaths of at least 32 civilians, including 16 children and 6 women, injured 10 other, including 5 children. And apparently the results of these investigations is going to be released in a forthcoming report. And Mike, if there was ever a way to ensure perpetual war to satiate the moneyed, blood-craving elites of the U.S. military-industrial complex, the U.S. government has certainly gotten this down to a science.
Yeah, go into a country, start blowing up civilian infrastructure, killing civilians, women and children. Yeah, it's going to be a long time before those people are going to want peace. But, in this case, it's backfiring. Because I have to applaud how tough the people of Yemen are. That they are still resisting, and Saudi Arabia is just not able to really gain anything. They're back to their starvation blockade. All right, we got to take a break for commercials, and we will be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show, and Claire, please take it away.
Well, as we all know, there have been more protests close to the Israeli borders, with Hamas and Israel threatening each other as to what they're going to do. And Israel's far-right government has tried to position its killing of protesters as self-defense while portraying them as terrorists. Israeli military officials, though, are beginning to think that this could backfire.
It already has.
And they say that they're not confident that they have the crowd control capacity to deal with tens of thousands of Gazans, which they may have, at the border. And my observation about this is that the Israeli government, in its usual fog of hubris, just doesn't at all comprehend how horrific the optics here already are. And it will get worse, particularly if such demonstrations are led by women, children, and infants in their dad's arms.
Well, interestingly enough, Fox News was just now showing the clouds of smoke coming from the tires that the Palestinians in Gaza had set on fire to try and prevent the snipers from killing people. But apparently the snipers are just firing blindly through the smoke.
They can't see.
That's right.
So they have no idea who they're
Which means
hitting.
They're pulling the trigger on people that they're not a threat. They can't say, I saw this person, it looked like they were a threat.
Yeah.
They're not seeing them at all. 2 killed so far, 250 injured. Anyway, we're going to go ahead and grab ourselves a phone call. James in Ohio, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hi, Mike. I just got some very interesting news on the war on opiates. Of course, I'm in Ohio, and Kasich is governor. He ran against Trump. I don't really know his voting record, but I'm assuming he's a rhino from some of the things he said. A while back, a couple of years ago, I think, they made a law that Kasich's panel that he convened on the opiate problem made a law that unless you have pain caused by cancer, which is pretty much intractable pain, you could only get a maximum of 100, the equivalent of 100 milligrams of morphine per day, which means a lot of people got, their pain meds cut more than in half. But today, I was told that, and this person was told this at 2 different pharmacies. If the pharmacy, say you have a prescription for 90 opiate pills, and it's just opiates, and the pharmacy runs out, you just don't get them. You can't go back and get more when they get a delivery, a shipment in.
Yeah.
You're just
that seems kind of awkward here. I'm having a hard time with their running on out. I mean, this whole opioid crisis began following the invasion of Afghanistan because the Taliban had eradicated opium production. If you were caught with a poppy, they'd take your hand off. A little draconian, but it did work. But as soon as the U.S. went on in there, the poppies were blooming. There were bumper crops. We've got photos of coalition troops, American troops, guarding and protecting those opium poppy fields. And cheap heroin, cheap opium began to flow into the United States, both at the street level and into the pharmaceutical corporations. And because the raw material for opiates was now so cheap, that became the product that they started pushing. And as we reported earlier... I do have a further point to make. Yes.
Well, I know from this family member that they, in the past couple of years, they have frequently had, I guess pharmacies don't keep a large stock of opiate drugs, and they've had to go back and they've got like a prescription partially filled and had to go back for more. But see, Ohio is part of the Rust Belt. It used to be the machine tool capital of the world, which machine tools are machines with which you make parts for other machines. And it's also, Ohio's a steel state. And I think, a lot of the people who need pain medication work their whole lives in a factory, therefore they're likely to be conservatives. And I know you don't like speculative thought much, but I think this is part of a way to keep older Ohioans from being more politically active because they're in pain. I really think that, it's just like the idea that heroin dealers did not always go around to 12 and 13-year-olds and give them the first couple shots for free, but they started doing that about 10 years ago. Now look.
Yes.
I think, it's probably politically motivated, but that's all I had for you. And thank you for your work, and everybody donate to RBN and Mike, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, James. We're going to let you go. And politics is part of the opium trade. When the CIA was bringing heroin in from Vietnam, they were specifically selling it into the black neighborhoods to keep the black population under control. Same thing when they were bringing in all this cocaine from Central America during the Iran-Contra scandal. It was being funneled into the black neighborhoods. That's why they got people like Freeway Ricky Ross to just make sure that all that crack was going into the black neighborhoods to basically keep them poor, to keep them under control, to demonize them. So yeah, there's a lot of politics involved there. We have to take another break for commercials, and we'll be back after these few words. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. And Claire, what is your next story?
Well, this comes to us from antiwar.com, another very conscientious pro-peace site that I link to frequently. And they're talking about the hiring of Pompeo and Bolton. And the statement it makes is very real. It says, connect those dots and it gets scary fast. In fact, the situation is starting to resemble a Hollywood-style wag the dog, drum up a war to distract the populace scenario. And the country against whom war is going to be declared, well, it's pretty darn obvious. It's going to be Iran.
Well, we know Iran has been on the list ever since Wesley Clark blew the lid off the U.S. agenda to dominate the Middle East economically, if not militarily. But there are a whole bunch of flashpoints that could head up. There's still the issue with Korea. There's still the issue with Syria. Turkey is the loose cannon on deck. Poroshenko is getting ready to launch something massive into the Donbass.
Right.
It's a very, very dangerous time right now. But we know that certainly Israel is exerting all the influence they can to put Iran on the top of the United States to be invaded list.
Yeah. And I don't know about you, but these two appointments taken together are causing the hair on the back of my neck to stand straight up and do Zumba. And I move like a brick. Yeah, it's very scary out there.
I'd actually pay to see that.
Ooh, okay. All right. Very interesting. Hillary unhinged. Clinton says Fox News is trying to impeach her.
What, does she think she's the president?
I guess.
Talk about delusional.
Yeah, not impeach, maybe arrest.
Absolutely.
And I'd also like to revisit this issue about Syria. The plan that he's talking about is probably going to de-escalate very nicely, but he's getting such opposition and not really being allowed to move on this. And
well, see, here's the problem. At this point, people who are getting their view of the world from someplace other than the TV set understand Russia and Syria have won this.
Yeah.
And that is not sitting well with a lot of people in the Defense Department because right now the United States has sort of built up a war momentum. It's like when Hitler came out of Germany and he just started knocking over country after country after country. He had momentum and he kept going. But as soon as that momentum began to falter is when the fortunes turned against Germany. We're in the same situation. We've knocked over country after country after country after country. If we're seen as having faltered or stumbled in Syria, then the rest of the war agenda is now at risk, including going into Iran.
Right.
And so the United States military probably may not think they can actually win in Syria, but they don't want to look like they lost. And so that's why they're continuing their U.S. presence in there. They're apparently building 2 more military bases inside Syria without the permission of the Syrian government, it should be noted.
Yes.
It's the same reason why they're continuing to pour all these resources into Afghanistan. They're never going to be able to conquer Afghanistan. They just don't want to have to admit that they lost one either.
And we're getting statements to the effect from Secretary of State Pompeo and Joint Chiefs of Staff Dunford talking about leaving Syria would not be in our national interests. But Mike, I've got to ask you, in whose national interest is being served by the American presence there? It's certainly not the interests of the American people.
No, it isn't. When they talk about U.S. interests, they're talking about U.S. business interests. They're talking about U.S. military interests.
Right.
They're talking about the interest in continuing the war agenda to get into Iran and actually get into a real war with Russia and China at this point.
Yeah, it's and it's very obvious that Israel wants regime change in Damascus. But I think I feel morally obligated to mention to President Trump that it wants this to happen, but only at the cost of American blood and American money. And if, in fact, that's the case, I would just politely suggest that the Israeli military invade Syria and see just what Russia is going to do about it. Because Russia's not going to let that stand for a moment, Mike.
Well, Russia doesn't want the situation to escalate, but on the other hand, the Israeli forces are really good at shooting unarmed Palestinians, but they haven't really done very well the few times they've tried to go into Lebanon and grab that Litani River. So I think if Israel were to go into Syria, absent the use of nuclear weapons, I think Syria would give them a real run for their money without necessarily needing the Russians to come on in and risk an escalation with the United States.
Because they're defending their home turf.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Let's bob on back to the U.S. here. I read this and I was absolutely stunned. There are residents of an Illinois village who have 60 days to surrender their guns or face a $1,000 a day fine.
Well, it's specifically aimed at the assault weapons.
Yeah.
And apparently on that list includes the Ruger 1022,
yeah.
which is a 22 caliber plinking gun.
Yeah.
And I know because Claire and I used to have one when we lived in Washington State.
Right.
And it looked mean and it looked nasty, but it's a 22. And all we ever did with it was target shoot. And then we wound up basically selling it. We sold all of those guns before we moved here to Hawaii. And again, these are people who don't really understand guns. They want the 1022 because it looks mean. But the 1022 is not an assault rifle. You can't assault, in the military sense, with a 22 caliber weapon.
Okay.
It's just absolutely impossible. And again, real criminals, real killers use small guns, handguns, disposable guns, rifles, long guns like the 1022 or the AR-15 account for single-digit percentage of crimes. But the reason the focus is on the assault weapons is the goal is not the safety of the American people.
No.
It is to basically reduce our ability to stand up to tyrannical government, which is the whole point of the Second Amendment.
Yeah, yeah. And the disputing of this law, I would like to hope, should go all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court should hear it.
Well, the Supreme Court has ruled already in several cases that the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms is an individual right to the individual American citizen, and that we are allowed to have the same weapons that the police and the military have.
Right.
Because holding off abusive government is the whole point. Now, we actually had a caller into the show a little while ago who said that Newsweek is running a propaganda story where comments are now being blocked, where they're claiming a judge has just ruled arbitrarily from the bench that the Second Amendment does not protect ownership of the AR-15. And there have already been these other court decisions that said, yeah, it's protected. But this is the real push. They want those sporting rifles because if there's a confrontation between the government and the American people, the government wants the government to have all the military weapons and machine guns, and they want you all to have starter pistols or even better airsoft guns.
Yep.
Once the attitude is, it comes down from Hitler. Take away the people's guns. Once you take away their guns, they'll do what you tell them to do.
Right.
And that is when we lose our freedom. That Second Amendment is what protects our rights and our freedoms.
It protects everything else.
Yes, it does.
Yeah. Very interesting article again out of Global Research. Sheryl Sandberg, who is the COO of Facebook, said that in order for users to opt out of sharing data, they're going to have to pay for it.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, because after all, your data is a thing of value, and if you're not willing to share that, well, then you're going to have to pay for that. Actually, Facebook's in trouble. People are canceling their accounts.
Yep.
The stock price is way down, and there's yet another scandal that's coming out. Actually, two of them.
Oh, really?
Apparently, Facebook launched a program to acquire medical records.
Yes,
and
I
pair
saw that.
them with Facebook users to build that data up. And apparently, somebody inside writing the software launched some kind of a bot where all of Mark Zuckerberg's personal messages to other Facebook users have magically disappeared. So
funny how that happened.
Well, so many of his earlier words have come back to haunt him now.
Yeah.
But again, at this point, privacy is gone in this country.
Yeah.
Your personal data is now a commodity to be sold to marketing companies, to be sold to cyber criminals. And it's amazing how many scammers seem to have access to this information in order to craft their emails to you to make it look like it's somebody that you know. And you click on that link and boom, you're hit with ransomware.
Yeah, and the very interesting thing that Ms. Sandberg didn't quantify was how much it's going to cost individuals to leave Facebook.
Well,
that was left very much unanswered.
Well, it's not a cost of leaving Facebook. It's a cost of not having Facebook share your data. But even if you paid that money, that's no guarantee they're not going to go on doing it.
No, definitely not.
Yeah.
Let's go to Asia. And You can say many things about Filipino President Rodrigo Duterte, but he does have kind of an interesting sense of humor because he stated, "If my plane explodes, ask the CIA." And Duterte made that observation after requesting arms from Russia and China because the U.S. didn't step up to the plate, because they were grating on him about human rights in his drug war, you know. And it's very obvious to me that Duterte has a very clear grasp of how the United States government deals with governments it does not like.
Well, the issue here is that Duterte represents the proverbial camel's nose under the tent, because right now the U.S. is using the current military tension around the world as a marketing tool to sell American weapons.
Yeah.
But following the demonstration of our weapons in Syria, that botched cruise missile attack,
oh dear,
and the stellar performance of the Russian weapons, more and more countries are abandoning U.S. arms sales, and they're going with Russia and China. Now, during time of peace, arms sales is a very corrupt process. The buyers will go into these arms shows, and they're wined and dined, and women are provided to them. And believe it or not, it happens in a lot of areas. I actually saw it happen in a computer animation convention where the company I was working for was selling software, and they had the private luxury suite and some very attractive women who were hosting it. And it was made very abundantly clear that if you were to sign a contract above a certain amount, that those women were there to make you happy with the decision.
Yes.
And it goes on with the arms sales all the time. During times of war or risk of war, the buyers get serious. And they turn down the wine, they turn down the women, they turn down the songs, and they say, I got to buy something that we can afford that's actually going to get the job done.
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing how that works.
I love this one.
Yeah. The Pentagon apparently has spent $60 million on a power station in Afghanistan that doesn't work.
They forgot to take the hamster.
Probably. Okay. Now, the United States has spent more than $800 billion on the never-ending war in Afghanistan, according to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Most of it was spent fighting the Taliban, but billions were also earmarked for reconstruction and infrastructure. And there is now a $60 million power system in northeast Afghanistan that doesn't provide any power. Apparently, there's a new report that's been released, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers mismanaged the project so badly that its power station isn't connected to a power source, has not been tested, and may be structurally unsound and pose a risk to Afghans who live near the transmission towers or lines. You know, I mean, Mike, can it get much more unbelievable than this? Come on.
Remember down in Iraq, they spent all this money to build a brand new police station, and they hadn't even finished it. It was starting to fall apart. It's all about cranking the money through to American contractors. The other problem with Afghanistan are the so-called ghost soldiers. And no, we're not talking about,
not that kind of ghost.
You know, apparently these Afghani commanders were just fabricating you know, thousands and thousands of soldiers who didn't exist, but they were all getting paid by the U.S. government.
Yeah. I mean, the Afghani people have been so betrayed by the U.S. and NATO with the invasion and occupation of their country under such completely false pretenses. And it was undertaken for the control of the pipeline routes and control of its opium problems. I mean, I almost don't know. I can't even begin to say how bad this was on so many levels, and what a horrible mistake it's turned out to be for Americans.
It is. It is, no question.
And I'd like to talk about Saudi Arabia and my title for Prince Salman, which is The Boy, and the acronym is The Butcher of Yemen, which he has turned out to be. And apparently there was an admission made by the Washington Compost in an article titled, Saudi Prince Denies Kushner is in His Pocket. The article would quote Saudi Prince Mohammed bin Salman, stating, asking about the Saudi-funded spread of Wahhabism, the austere faith that is dominant in the kingdom, and some have accused of being a source of global terrorism.
It is a very extreme form.
Yeah. And war crimes and the hush money to paper them over in the corporate prostitute media. This is what the U.S. has in common, the U.S. government, with Saudi Arabia and Israel. And they could do that and pretty much get away with it before the advent of the independent media.
That's us.
Yep. Hello. And I'd be very happy to tell the boy, a.k.a. the butcher of Yemen, a.k.a. Saudi Arabia's Prince Salman, that I am profoundly unhappy with the U.S. colluding in Saudi war crimes in Yemen. It doesn't make me happy as an American citizen who cares about our country and its future.
Well, it's not just colluding.
Yeah.
We've just found out recently the U.S. is actually directing the Saudi airstrikes.
Yeah.
Along with providing aerial refueling.
Right. And, you know, if Mike and I were younger and had the money, I'd love to be able for us to immigrate to a country which doesn't indulge in these obscenely immoral practices. I hear that the Principality of Andorra is just lovely, and expats from other countries can get extended visas.
Well, we could go to the Principality of Sealand. I mean, we're
Yes.
already a lord and lady of Sealand.
Yes,
so,
yes.
All right.
But do they offer passports, dear?
Well, they're working on it. The problem is they're not recognized.
Okay. You know, I have no power or influence in the bowels of power in D.C. I'm neither moneyed nor connected in any meaningful way. But I will tell you, Mike, as long as I am breathing, I will continually, peacefully witness to any war crimes in which the U.S. government and military are involved. And I'm going to share that with the rest of the world. I don't care who doesn't like it.
All right. We got to take another break for commercials, and we will be right back. Aloha America, welcome back to our show. Last segment of our program on this Pauhana Friday. And Claire, you've got another story for us?
Oh, yeah. Apparently, there's a new surveillance camera software which allows law enforcement to identify groups of people in real time. Let's take a look at the following scenario. You're walking down a public street on your way to dinner with your family. Now imagine police knowing exactly who you are and the names and ages of every family member. But wait, it gets worse because the surveillance doesn't stop there. Once you have entered the restaurant, police can use what is called Project Greenlight, Project NOLA, or any other police camshare program to spy on you while you're eating. The above video warns everyone that police smartphones could store up to 1 million faces, and their laptops could have access to 50 million faces. And what makes this frightening is it reveals that a police department's servers could have access to a staggering 1 billion faces. There aren't even 1 billion in the U.S. So why would a police department need access to that many faces? You know, it's a question that needs to be asked.
Well, they may be in preparation of the North American Union, where they're going to be scanning everybody. They may have faces that from outside the country that they're looking for. The problem is they're going to hit the same problem the NSA does.
Yeah.
They're collecting so much data, they're really not going to be able to make sense of it.
Yeah.
And if we're talking about 50 million faces, I question the ability for it to work in real time. And again, the problem with all of this whiz-bang high-tech, it's very expensive, a lot of tax dollars going into it. They still haven't gotten away from the problem of the false positives, because a lot of people look very much alike.
Yeah.
And the issue that they could get the wrong person.
Yeah.
And very often the false positives outweigh the real positives. And if police are convinced that these systems are absolutely perfect, then innocent people are going to be hurt.
Yeah, yeah, and that's where it gets nasty. Absolutely. Yes. And speaking of communications, apparently the DHS is confirming the presence of cell site simulators in Washington, D.C.
And we're not talking about the police stingrays.
No. They're being operated by potentially malicious actors in our nation's capital.
Okay, well, let's narrow it down.
Yeah.
What is the one nation that can come and go as they please in and out of the United States of America?
Israel.
Yes.
Yeah. And so my response to this article was, And the DHS and NSA are impotent to identify these alleged malicious actors and stop this?
The fact that this hardware got into the United States and got installed up there in plain sight on these poles.
Yeah.
You know, it's not hidden in a cupboard somewhere. It's just up on these towers.
Yeah.
Tells us Department of Homeland Security failed again.
Yeah.
It's just failure after failure after failure after failure. All right. Well, we're coming up on the end of the program here. Everybody have a really good weekend. Try and relax. I know it's very, very difficult. Keep peeking out the window looking for a mushroom cloud.
Yeah.
Stay tuned for John Stadmiller. I'm sure he's got a lot of interesting things to share with you. We'll be back on Monday. Aloha, America.